ocean. It is the wolf of the seas. It hunts in packs, feasting on seals and whales. The killer whale. One of its favorite hunting grounds is the entire west coast of North America. These hunters have no enemies. But it now appears that they are at risk of becoming extinct before the end of the 21st century. The clue to their fate is new. The appearance of friendly orphans, and it's an ominous sign that this is a killer in peril. A city is no place for a killer whale. But in January of 2002, 5 kilometers from Seattle, Washington, a young orca is sighted in Puget Sound. It seems to be about 2 years old, only a baby. The orca, or killer whales as they're commonly known, virtually never travel alone. This 570-kilogram baby is in a dangerous place, swimming in heavy boat and ferry traffic. Ken Balcom, a well-known whale biologist in the Seattle area, is one of the first on the scene to investigate.
This is a whale that had the great potential for just bonding to a human. If you were there, she'd come to you. You could slap the water, she'd slap her flipper. You could say roll over, she'd roll over.
But no one knows where this killer whale came from, or why she is alone. Balcom has been keeping track of the orcas in these waters for 27 years. He knows every orca that lives here, but this one is a mystery. Somehow, she's become separated from the rest of her family. First, Balcom needs to know where this lost young whale comes from. She could be from one of 3 very different populations of killer whales. One type are known as transients. These are the ocean's fiercest hunters, eating only marine mammals, including some species of whales. Transient killer whales travel up and down the Pacific coast of the United States and Canada. And there is one more possibility. These killer whales are called residents. They too travel up and down the coast, but return to the same feeding grounds every year. Through information gathered in Puget Sound, the baby is identified as Springer, a Canadian killer whale. Soon after, its identity is confirmed by Canada's leading killer whale experts. John Ford and Graham Ellis have been tracking and identifying orcas for over 30 years. Each year they head out into the Johnstone Strait to study killer whales.
This area right here in Johnstone Strait is probably the best easily accessible known location for viewing killer whales and studying them in the world. And as a result, most of what we know about killer whales scientifically has been learned with this population here and the sort of sister community, the southern residents off southern Vancouver Island.
Since 1973, these researchers have been taking mugshots of killer whales using dorsal fins to identify them. Dorsal fins are like fingerprints. Each fin has nicks and scrapes that are unique to each animal. Ellis and Ford's long-term killer whale study is probably the most detailed of its kind in the world. Ironically, killer whales aren't whales at all. They're dolphins, the largest of their kind. But they are deadly. They'll hunt fish, marine mammals, and even attack a bear or moose if it decides to swim too far from shore.
Just trying to see what groups are here. They're really spread out.
Who's that over there, Graham?
I think that's I-24 with their new calf and I-49, I believe.
This is A54 with her very first calf. And her mother, A30's grandmother's here as well. So you got 3 generations right here.
killer whales travel in groups as large as 20 members. Ford and Ellis have discovered that each of these pods is actually an extended family.
Really, it took a number of years before it was clear that what we were dealing with here was a very unusual social system, strongly matrilineal in that every whale in the pod is actually descended from females in the group. So those big males are not the fathers of the offspring in the group. They're actually the grown-up sons of the mothers and the grandmothers in the group. They never leave the group. And this is what's so unusual about resident killer whales. It's a closed social system. The only way into one of these pods is to be born into it, and the only way out really is to die. I-33.
Yeah, she's surrounded.
Ford and Ellis know their killers well, and their expertise helped identify the mysterious orphan in Seattle.
It took some time to sleuth out exactly who it was, but it turned out it was a young 2-year-old whale from a pod that we know very well, and her sort of popular name is Springer. And so this young whale seemed to have become orphaned. We think her mother died, and in that process she became separated from the rest of the matriline, the rest of the pod, and wandered around until she ended up in Seattle Harbor.
The news spreads fast, and Springer becomes an instant celebrity, making headlines and the 6 o'clock news. Everyone, it seems, wants to know about this abandoned baby. Experts at the Vancouver Aquarium are called in to help. The American government asks for advice from veterinarian Dr. David Huff, who also has extensive experience with killer whales.
About every 3 weeks or so, we would go down and go out in one of their boats and just kind of hang out with her.
Dr. Huff suspects that Springer is sick. The clue is her breath. It has an acetone odor called ketosis.
When you got anywhere near the blow from her exhalation and sniffed it, it was like opening a can of paint thinner.
Springer's bad breath might be caused by consuming her own body fat to survive, a sign that she could be starving.
With that as background,
In Seattle, the environmental groups Orca Conservancy and the Earth Island Institute find the money to finance a rescue mission.
we're dealing with a wild animal. She's never been restrained before. She will resist. That's her natural reaction.
Springer is about to make history for her species and our own. By May, about 4 months after being discovered swimming alone in Puget Sound, it's clear that Springer, the orphan killer whale, needs to be rescued. The problem is how. Jeff Foster, the world's leading expert on capturing killer whales in the wild, is called in to help. Foster brings his team to Seattle to plan their strategy.
When you're dealing with live animals, and you never know how they're going to respond, and so it's important to have contingency plans.
Foster's first idea is to lure Springer into a canvas sling. It's tricky, like convincing a whale to put on a raincoat, but it's the easiest way to get her into a boat. Plan B is a giant underwater pen that can hold Springer if she refuses to swim into the sling. The challenge here is convincing her to swim inside.
This will hang down. It's 30 feet deep. We have a lead line on the bottom that weighs approximately 100 pounds. Now, it's light enough that she can lift that lead line up if she does get into one of the corners, so she can still take her breaths and everything. But when you put this much net in the water, there is that concern of it catching the currents like a sail and the stuff bagging. So the way they designed the net and hung the net, it should hang fairly straight in the water if we're at slack tides.
It will take a small army of scientists and support boats to capture Springer, plus a lot of money. But why does this killer whale deserve the royal treatment? Part of the answer is that killer whales have become a Hollywood icon, and in the Pacific Northwest especially, they're public animal number one.
Once considered vermin on this coast, these animals are now icons of the Wild West Coast, and people come from around the world to see them. They live in societies that are complex, and we can actually relate to them as being highly social mammals ourselves, where their young animals are tended by the adults in the group, and they have these very cohesive societies.
To the public, Springer is a baby in trouble. To scientists, she's the future of a species in trouble.
Starting in the mid-90s, things started to change. The southern residents first peaked and then started on a declining trend. More recently, the northern residents seem to have gone on a similar declining trend. And so this has kind of triggered a few alarm bells. Why are their numbers going down?
The killer whales living near Seattle are in trouble. 20% have died in the last 10 years, leaving a mere 84 orca. The northern residents off Vancouver Island have 200 members, but their population too is declining. Orca breed slowly, and today's losses could signify the beginning of the end. Ken Balcom has been watching the southern residents closely, and he doesn't like what he sees. Using photo identification, he has constructed a family tree of the southern residents.
We put up all the living whales, their photographs are here. And all these other spots are little tombstones of whales that were alive during the study but have died. This is one little mature line that's totally dead. There's another mature line up here that only has the grandma surviving. All the youngsters are dead. So what this story is saying is that there's a very high mortality of young and middle-aged animals that should not be occurring. We have the older animals are still here. Something happened that has reduced their fertility and their immune response. They're just dying.
Balcom's data shows clearly that young orca like Springer are dying far too often, and being alone doesn't help.
We realized Springer's long-term survival chances were very, very poor, and that likely we would need to intervene and get her out of that area back to Johnson Strait up in this area, where she might have a chance of reintegrating with her pod or related pod.
In British Columbia, Springer would find more food, cleaner water, and a chance to reunite with her family. But to get there now, she'll have to be captured, treated, and released. To do that, Jeff Foster needs to earn her trust. He makes many trips out to visit Springer. It's like a courtship. Foster wants her to get to know the team, as well as the ropes he'll be using. The team gives Springer back rubs and hang the stretcher in the water, hoping she'll get used to it. But time is running out.
She was going in smaller and smaller area around the ferries, and we all felt it was just a matter of time before she got run over and either killed or badly injured.
Game plan is just trying to get everybody out as close as we can, then we'll go over and interact with her, and then start moving everything into position if we can.
Now, 6 months after Springer was discovered, Foster and his team are told to capture the orphan killer whale. They try a test run first to see if she's ready.
It's a great day. We've been really lucky with the weather pattern this time of year. Usually in Seattle in June, you can never depend on it at all. Conditions are right. Really, the only thing that's working against us right now is our tidal action. We have some of the lowest tides of the year, so that's going to work a little bit against us.
Foster decides to use Plan B and attempt to lure the baby killer whale into the net enclosure. It appears that the team's courtship has worked. Springer happily swims up to the underwater cage, but the baby orca is playing hard to get. She takes a quick look around and then changes her mind.
Yeah, I'm very happy that 2 different occasions she swam in and actually into the enclosure itself. It would have been pretty easy to put a tail line on her, but that's okay. I think there was so much activity around. She did cooperate. She did go inside the enclosure, and then she lost interest and left.
It's a good start, but to save Springer's life, the rescue team will need to try again. And the sooner the better. Springer has now been swimming alone in Washington's Puget Sound for at least 6 months. And the scientists here are keen to take her home to Canada. But why the rush? Puget Sound is already home to 84 killer whales. They eat the same food as Springer. Why not let them adopt this orphaned orca? The problem is that local killer whales will have nothing to do with Springer. And the reason? she has a foreign accent. No one understands killer whale communication better than John Ford. For 15 years, he's been studying their sophisticated, mysterious language. Ford is able to eavesdrop on the whales by dropping a special waterproof microphone into the ocean.
Goes down to perhaps 10 meters. Perhaps make a little recording here. Very distinctive dialect sounds of I-31 pod. And the animals are kind of scattered foraging. We're ahead of them, so we're detecting their high-pitched echolocation clicks. These sounds here, sort of popping sounds, they're clicks that they're using to navigate to find food.
Killer whales live in waters where visibility is often less than 7 meters, and so they use sound the way a bat does, as a kind of radar. They bounce their clicks off fish and rocks, listening to the echo to judge distance.
They also use a very complex set of very distinctive loud calls that are between 1 and 2 seconds long within the group and between groups to keep in touch. It seems each individual born to a group learns a repertoire of calls that is actually a sort of a vocal tradition in that lineage that allows it seems, to be part of that group.
This is where Springer learned her calls, from her own family called the A-pod, and she's still using their distinct dialect. It should help her family recognize Springer, if she can be returned north to these waters.
These dialects are very stable. Probably they outlive the actual individuals in the group, so I suspect that some of these major dialects have been around probably for decades, if not centuries, and are just simply passed on from generation to generation. Those kind of calls are very typical of their repertoire, their dialect.
Like humans, killer whales aren't born with their calls and have to learn them from their families. Killer whales can learn up to 12 distinct sounds unique to their pod. Springer had mastered them before she lost her mother and wandered into Puget Sound. But Springer's dialect is causing problems here in Washington. Local whales can tell she's a stranger just by the way she sounds. Her timing is terrible. This 2-year-old needs her family to teach her how to hunt for fish. Ironically, if she was much older, her dialect might attract a mate. Lance Barrett Leonard is a population geneticist at the Vancouver Aquarium. He has used John Ford's acoustic research to understand how dialects affect a killer whale's love life.
Neither males nor females leave their mothers, and so of course the obvious question is, are they inbred, and if not, how do they avoid inbreeding? This led me into a fairly extensive set of paternity tests.
DNA was collected from killer whales. The genes of the young were compared to genes of older males in the pods, and the results were striking. None of the older males were fathers of the calves. This proved that fathers are outsiders who don't live with the mothers or their children.
So although they spend their entire lives living in their natal pod, they don't breed within it. The fathers were always outside the pod. Resident killer whales are organized not only into pods but into clans, or acoustic clans, or language groups, dialect groups. And the fathers of calves are usually outside the dialect group or the clan.
Killer whales, it seems, use the equivalent of one-night stands to avoid incest, and fathers are always strangers, who sound very different from the pod. Females even choose elderly males so that their daughters can't mate with their fathers by mistake. For killer whales, this is the language of love. But for Springer, it may be years before her dialect attracts a mate. And right now, she needs human help simply to get home. In Seattle, Jeff Foster's team gets ready for a second rescue attempt. Once again, the team sets out to capture Springer, but this time, they'll use their hands. The ocean currents are too strong to use the net enclosure today.
There's always a potential danger jumping into the water with a large animal. These animals are very powerful. You don't know how they're going to respond when they're in that kind of situation.
If the plan works, it will be the first time a wild orca has ever been captured in order to be returned to the wild. Foster has been earning Springer's trust for weeks. Now it's time to put it to the test. The first step is to slip a noose around Springer's tail.
It was nerve-wracking. He had incredible patience and just waited for exactly the right time. I'm thinking, this isn't going to work today, this isn't going to work. And then all of a sudden, Jeff just slipped the noose over the tail, pulled on it, and it was amazing.
Once we had the tail line on her and we were able to cinch it up, then we knew that we had her under somewhat control. And then at that point, it's important to get in there and raise her head and get a hold of her pectoral fins and hang onto the dorsal, because they have a tendency to spin when they're in the tail loop, and get her up and make sure she has good solid breaths.
All she did was do a few little sort of tentative duck dive things with her head and slap her tail around a couple times.
More bodies, more people in the water.
Once we had the control of the head, we brought other divers into the water to be able to manipulate her back into the stretcher.
This is the dangerous part. A thrashing 500-kilogram killer whale can easily break a diver's bones. Foster's team has come to expect it, but Springer puts up very little resistance.
Bradley called landing craft in. Yeah, they're on their way.
Surrounded on all sides, she allows the team to slip her into a stretcher. It's the beginning of the strangest ride of her young life.
Just see what is
a little bit, just a placement. Let's clear the belly strap. Yeah.
She is hoisted onto a barge that will be her home for the next hour. The first stage of Springer's journey home to her family in Canada is complete. But no one knows if they will accept her, or if she will be healthy enough to make the trip. After spending months all alone, 2-year-old Springer is now surrounded by doting adults. The orphan killer whale doesn't appear upset, and her human friends are thrilled.
Yeah, she was going like this, and I just didn't want to bump her with it.
Springer is on her way home, but she won't be going to Canada right away. First, she needs to be admitted to a unique animal hospital. Her speckled skin and low weight prove that she's sick and in need of treatment quickly.
This we're going to use to test all of her general health parameters. Try to understand, one, how she's doing, and if she has any major medical problems, what we can do about it. So this is
Springer's care is now in the hands of veterinarians from the United States and Canada.
We wanted to give her a clean bill of health and a health certificate. It was very important to check her to make sure that she wasn't going to bring any diseases back from Puget Sound to the whales in northern Vancouver Island and put her pod or other pods up north at risk.
It's extremely important to get a blood sample. We had to find out if she had any inborn errors of metabolism. Was there something inherent in her that would not make her one that we would want to return to her pod?
For the rescue team, Springer is a rare opportunity. For most of them, they're used to studying killer whales hands-on in aquariums or washed up dead on a beach. This is a chance to both study and cure a living wild killer whale. And Springer's been living in a dangerous place. Industrial chemicals have been pouring into the ocean here for decades. The situation has become so drastic that wildlife toxicologist Peter Ross was asked to investigate, and his findings are shocking.
The Pacific killer whales frequenting the waters off Vancouver, Victoria, Seattle are now considered the most contaminated marine mammals anywhere in the world. And when I say contaminated, I'm talking about PCBs, polychlorinated biphenyls. We tend to be concerned about these chemicals because they're very toxic. They tend to be very persistent. They're fat soluble, they bioaccumulate in food chains. They just don't disappear.
PCBs were banned in Canada and the United States over 20 years ago. But just as Peter Ross found, they didn't go away. They drift through the air and in the oceans and are still manufactured in Russia. PCBs collect in ocean sediment and are then gobbled up by fish. The salmon stocks of the Pacific coast are one of the primary food sources for resident killer whales like Springer, and they too contain PCBs and many other contaminants.
The whales are getting a double whammy here. They're at the top of the food chain, eating concentrated amounts of toxic prey, and they live a long time, and they're unable to offload it.
Males seem to have it worst. They spend their entire lives collecting and storing PCBs in their fat tissues. Females, however, can actually lose PCBs. The chemicals leave their bodies through the fat in breast milk and are passed on to their young. Springer was probably born with PCBs, and the fish she has been eating contain them too. Her low weight suggests that her body has survived by consuming body fat, a perfect way to release PCBs into the bloodstream.
We know that PCBs cause cancer. We know that PCBs affect the immune system. This means they're more vulnerable to disease. They may be more vulnerable to getting a cold or a little infection, or that cold might develop into a much more serious infection that they can't recover from.
No one knows why Springer's mother died, but she was part of a generation that came of age when PCBs were still being produced legally, and her death may have been caused by side effects of the chemical. PCBs are now one of the prime suspects in the deaths of American killer whales. With no natural enemies, most killer whales should die of old age. But the southern resident population here is down to just 84 members, and it seems to be both the young and the PCB generation that are dying the most. Springer's doctors aren't exactly sure why she's sick. It could be PCBs, even a genetic anomaly. They decide to run a series of tests, hoping that they can cure her and then send her home. For now, this holding pen is both home and hospital, although no one here is sure that she'll be a willing patient and remain inside.
Two riskiest aspects of the whole capture were when you first go in the water with her and try to control her head during the capture itself, and then also when we put her into an environment with walls, the net pen. We don't know how she's going to respond. If she wanted to and swam hard enough and fast enough, she could go punch right through the net. And she's from a three-dimensional world where she doesn't have really any barriers, and they don't know what to do when they come to a corner. A lot of times they can get their nose down into a net, or if the net isn't hung properly, they can get entangled in it very easily.
Springer has a good chance of recovering and ultimately returning to Canada to connect with her pod. But first, Springer's rescuers will have to practice a little whale medicine on a very sick child of the sea. Springer, the orphan killer whale, is now safe in a holding pen just outside of Seattle, Washington. Before she can return home to Canada, she needs a clean bill of health and a lot of help to get there. Dr. Peter Schrader is an American veterinarian, and it's his job to help Springer get better. The first challenge is her skin condition. Killer whales spend a lot of time rubbing against each other. It does feel good, but it's more than just a show of affection.
Her skin looked terrible. I've never seen skin like that on a cetacean. These animals are tremendously tactile. They're always rubbing against one another because under those layers of cells, marine algae can grow, fungus can grow, and these cells have to be sloughed off, which makes the skin healthy. Rubbing against another animal helps that process.
Springer has been alone for at least 6 months without any relatives to rub against. It's left her lonely and itchy. Dr. Schrader realizes that she needs something to rub against, and as often as possible. Fortunately, Springer provides her own inspiration. The team retrieves a stick she's been playing with in Puget Sound. A log is soon added. These whale toys work wonders.
Within probably an hour, she was doing barrel rolls and circles and basically quivering all over with joy. She could get a little push against this, which started to help her skin right away and help her psyche. I mean, she felt good doing that. I think it was obvious.
But Springer needs more than a log to make her feel better. She's underweight by at least 100 kilograms and needs to get her appetite back quickly. Dr. Schrader and his team want to help, but they know they can't get too close. If Springer gets used to human company, she may find it hard to return to the wild. The team decides to stay out of sight and use cameras to spy on their patient.
It's a remote monitoring system, so we can minimize our presence out around the pool side. And this is just a real handy way with a remote operated camera that can go anywhere on the pool, and we can monitor everything she's doing.
Springer gets fed using another kind of remote system. A 10-meter-long tube is designed to deliver live fish to the pen. A healthy killer whale will eat between 50 and 150 kilograms of fish a day. Springer is eating only 1 or 2 fish. Somehow, she's lost her appetite. Schrader first suspects that Springer's exposure to PCBs has compromised her immune system. But stool samples show exactly what is making her sick.
She had worms, and we know that worms will keep the immune status triggered. If the immune system is triggered long enough and often enough, it'll basically wear out over time.
Dr. Huff remains on site as the Canadian veterinarian. He and Dr. Schrader decide on a plan to get rid of Springer's worms.
Dr. Pete Schrader and I passed a stomach tube and put about 6 liters of water into her. And then we followed it up with a chaser of deworming medicine.
This worm medicine, which is the same kind of worm medicine that people use for cows and horses. It's not a special worm medicine for whales. 2 hours after that treatment, she started eating as if she finally realized that I have an appetite.
It was absolutely amazing. She ate so well that our concern then was not to overfeed her. So it was a remarkable turnaround.
It's in her mouth. Now it's gone.
After that, we could no longer smell the ketosis on her breath. The skin just started looking much, much better. And from that point on, we never again saw live worms in her stool.
For the first time in months, Springer appears happy and healthy. She's getting the strength she needs to return to the wild, and her recovery is just in time. Every July, her family returns to southern British Columbia to hunt salmon. Springer needs to find them within the next month. No one knows where killer whales go in the winter, so it's now or never.
We decided it would be prudent to give her some antibiotics to prevent any disease. This was a request by the Canadian veterinarian, Dr. Huff.
Dr. Schrader has the medication injected into fish, so he can be sure that Springer gets a full dose. Now the Canadian government can be confident that Springer won't be importing any diseases into her family's pod. After 1 month in Whale Hospital, Springer is finally ready to go home. Jeff Foster and his team return to load Springer onto a large catamaran that will take her north. Springer has gained weight, over 70 kilograms, and needs a crane to help her get on board. For some, it is a bittersweet moment. Dr. Schrader has spent a month with Springer, sleeping in a trailer next to her pen each night.
She wants to go home, and we're about to take her there. So it's with great joy, but a bit of not reluctance, but I guess, poignancy that we get her to go back with her wild today. Kind of like turning loose one of your kids to college, I guess.
It is a 12-hour trip from Puget Sound to Vancouver Island. During the journey, Springer needs to be kept wet. She also needs to be acclimatized to her new environment.
All the way along, we were pumping in seawater and pumping out seawater so that by the time she got to Johnstone Strait, it wasn't as if she was changing from Puget Sound water to Johnstone Strait water. There was no sudden change in temperature, no sudden change in composition. There were no variables for her.
Springer's boat reaches the Canadian border and a country that is delighted to have her back.
Fisheries and Oceans Canada really would like to thank you and acknowledge the tremendous work that National Marine Fisheries Service has done, Jeff Foster and his team, and all the other organizations and individuals taking care of A73 and preparing her to come home on this journey. Canada has just an excellent team ready to take over and begin the next phase of this, which is bringing her home.
She's being ferried to the Johnstone Strait, home to 200 resident killer whales, including her own family. The Orphaned gets a hero's welcome from the local Aboriginal peoples. Where European culture has often feared and loathed killer whales, First Nations of the Pacific Northwest revere the killer whale as one of the guardians of the oceans. But Springer won't be rejoining her family right away. Jeff Foster and his team lower her into another holding pen. She needs to rest after her confusing high-speed journey north. Now there's only one challenge left: to reunite Springer with her family. No one is sure if this long-lost orphan will be accepted back into the pod. And the answer will surprise everyone. After being lost and alone for months, Springer, the orphan killer whale, is finally back in Canada. Her arrival home attracts a flood of attention from both the public and the media.
The whole Springer event was something that none of us had ever been through before. There was incredible interest in the whole operation, something that we've never seen, of course. And everybody was saying, okay, when are you going to let her go? You know, she's here now. And we had a number of criteria that had to be met, of course, in order to release her from the net pen.
Fortunately, the timing is good for a family reunion. Springer's family, the A-Pod, have returned to the Johnstone Strait for the annual salmon runs. John Ford and Graham Ellis have discovered that Springer's birth family has shrunk to only 3 members, including a grandmother and a great-aunt. This small group may not want Springer back after the death of her mother.
We didn't know whether this would work or not. It had never been attempted. This was really an experiment to see if this whale that had been out of its pod and any other kind of pod for at least 6 months, probably longer, would be accepted back into the group or would want to go back to the group.
The Canadian team decides to keep Springer in the pen for several weeks, giving her time to recover from her long boat trip north. It may also take time for any of her extended family to swim by.
Turned out she was vigorous. She was not fazed at all by the transport.
But what happens next surprises everyone.
That first night, whales came swimming by and there was clear acoustic exchanges between Springer and the whales.
She went wild. She got very excited into that pen, started to breach. And she was sort of screaming, calling out as loudly as she could and blowing our headphones off as we listened to her on the hydrophone.
She was very excited, pushing at the net. She wanted out.
The very next morning, Springer's pod arrives and seems to be waiting for the prodigal whale.
It was more than we could have possibly hoped for. It was amazing. We all looked at ourselves and said, is this really happening? Is it really this good?
The team knows they have to make a decision.
They're split into 2 groups. I want a one-word answer. Is it a go on their part? If it is, Flynn wants a one-word answer, yes or no.
It was nerve-wracking for me because all the capture team is in there holding her back, and the researchers are out a mile or 2 in the bay, and I'm trying to relay the message to them. But there really was no discussion. Everybody knew it was the best it was ever going to get.
We sort of did a quick vote over little walkie-talkies with all the various people who were involved, and I said, okay, let's do it.
Drop the net, open it up. It's being done now.
After at least 6 months away from her family, Springer takes her chance to go home.
Straight out and she's still under. Good, eh? The net's open, she's out and she hasn't come up yet. It looks like she's heading straight out.
Yeah. She was typical Springer. She made a beeline for the whales, and when she got about 2/3 of the way there, went, oh, kelp. Let me play for a minute.
Good marks right off here. How far?
Ironically, Springer seems in no rush for a family reunion. She stops 30 meters away and keeps her distance. Then, the whales swim away from each other.
We thought, uh-oh, maybe she doesn't want to be a wild whale anymore. So the initial reaction on both parts was not very encouraging.
And the stakes are high. Springer is not the only killer whale who needs help. 500 kilometers away, on the northwestern tip of Vancouver Island, another baby killer whale has gotten lost. His name is Luna, and he hails from the toxic waters off Seattle. Luna is also rubbing up against boats and needs to find his own family.
We're not decided on what we should do about Luna down the road. We'll just have to, I think, continue assessing the success of the Springer operation to see whether it's worth trying a similar kind of thing with Luna. The southern residents really need him. They can't really spare any other animals. They're declining in numbers, and it'd be great to see him back into that population.
The Springer rescue is providing a reason for hope. 4 days after her release, she joins up with a 15-year-old female from a related pod. It seems that Springer has been adopted. The first time this behavior has ever been observed in the wild. For now, it's a good omen for lost or stranded killer whales in the future. And thanks to Springer, scientists now know that killer whales can be rescued and taken home. But the bigger problem is that home may not be a safe place for any killer whale. Noise pollution from boats can affect their navigation, and PCBs are already known to cause serious health problems.
We're going to be with this problem for a number of years. We should at least identify the root causes. We should hope that there is some potential good ending to all this.
When animals eat things that are toxic, that interfere with their hormones, that are different than what they've evolved with, it's going to have an effect on their reproductive rate. And that population is probably destined to become extinct unless there's going to be some major changes.
For the first time, scientists have rescued a stranded killer whale. They may need that skill in the years to come. The vast Pacific itself appears to be in a state of peril, and on the horizon there may be an epidemic of orphaned or stranded killer whales. Today, the ocean is not a safe place to be, especially for its mightiest and most magnificent hunter.
Thank you.